The director of the Art Students League at that time was a woman named Rosina Florio. She'd been there for a good while. And she told Will about me, and it turned out that Will was spending summers about 6-7 miles from our summer studio in Maine. We each painted during the month of July, August, part of September in Maine. And his daughter called me, invited me to dinner, and we absolutely hit it off right off the bat. And before you knew it, it was kind of like being neighbors. We turned out we were neighbors in New York too, so the friendship developed in New York and in Maine. But when we were in Maine, it was, instead of saying, "Can I borrow a cup of sugar?" he'd say, "I'm out of fixative," or "Do you have any paint thinner?" or "Do you have some turpentine?" And we'd run back and forth, and I'd bring him in my studio and show him what I was working on. And I often saw what he was working on too. So a friendship developed very, very quickly, and also with our wives. Well, he influenced me a number of ways. By the time I met him, I was at least in my early 40s and had gone through art school with several degrees and had been somewhat recognized. But he opened doors for me. That was very nice. But he also had a great love of art history. We both shared that. And I looked at how parts of art history influenced him in ways I never suspected. And so I began to think of how art history could influence me in ways that I'd never suspected. I loved how clearly he flattened space, and we talked about how I controlled space instead of flattening it. So we had discussions. I could have discussions with him about art that I couldn't have with anyone else. And he also had me slow down. He said that he thought I painted a little faster than I needed to. And for what I was doing, it was probably about right, but when I did slow down, he was absolutely right. My work got much more complex. I was surprised at what he had said, and he was a master educator. He was one of the great teachers of the 20th century. He had influenced Cy Twombly. Janet Fish, I think, was influenced by him. Audrey Flack was influenced by him. James Rosenquist, great painter, just passed away this last year, was influenced. And James Rosenquist used to get Cuban cigars and give a box to Will every month. And when Will passed away, he left a box of those cigars for me, along with his humidor. So for Will to have influence on all those major painters, and then to be a friend, develop the friendship that we had, I was lucky because there was a little guidance that came along with the friendship, and it was just so beautifully done. It made me a better painter, no doubt. Some of the pieces in this exhibition that I'd want to point out to a visitor to RAM, just as you go in, there's the print called The Reader, a woman with a cat on her lap looking up, reading at the book, and there's this tension between her line of sight and the book, and also the cat looking at you. There's this three-way vision happening. The book almost has a life of its own. The book was used as a poster to encourage people to read on a national basis, and for people to be welcomed with that as the first thing they see coming in is a nice touch, because it brings this national image right to Fort Smith. Another piece that seems to be a real favorite here is the mother and child piece, and I particularly like that because it's a small print, but he did larger versions of it, and he also had a painting of that, and that painting, that image, print, painting, etc., also has an abstract that almost matches it perfectly. The elements of what they called Indian space painting, that was an abstract language that Will developed. That abstract language comes right into that right into the image of mother and child. And so at that point, he's beginning to merge abstraction into a very, very personal, figurative style, and I think it's thrilling to see that. There's a preliminary drawing that shows his daughter Ona quite beautifully feeding a grain, some little piece of food to a bird, and it shows the bird eating and being so close to his daughter. But there's a cat up on the windowsill who's looking down at the bird. Maybe the cat's thinking about eating the bird too. It's this wonderful cycle of life that goes through there, all elegantly done, all beautifully designed. Same thing with the Will Barnet portrait. If anybody Googles the image, I think it's the purple vase, they'll see a purple vase in the final painting. We don't see that in that preliminary drawing, and he changes the whole concept of it. It shows you how carefully he thought everything out, and the painting with the blue robe is so elegant. Shows the waist and that shape that just comes up and then drops down at the waist, and how it plays against the trees is elegant. It's beautiful, and again, all of these finished pieces play against all of the pieces that were preliminary drawings. You get a chance to kind of look inside his mind and see how he was thinking and working out the development of these images, whether they were for prints, which he loved to do. He was a master printmaker, or for painting, which he was also one of the great masters of the 20th century. Well, the Japanese prints are an interesting idea, but before I even talk about Japanese prints, let me just talk about his prints in general. Okay. When he got to New York, to the Art Students League, the person who had influenced him first was a French painter and printmaker, caricaturist named Henri Daumier. And Daumier's drawings are so animated, and it's kind of fun. It was one of the things we had in common, because there used to be kind of a nickname for me. They used to call me Young Daumier. A handful of people did, and the fact that Will and I both love Daumier, his earliest work almost looks like Daumier did them, except that they're early 20th century imagery. And as he developed into an artist and got the language of modern painting at the Art Students League, I think that there was a very strong Egyptian influence. There was a strong influence from all the old masters. If you look, there are these clues, but the flatness of the Japanese prints and Chinese prints are very, very evident in Will's work. And by the 1930s and 40s, the influence of Japanese art had been there for 40, 50 years, and there was a fresh look at how it all functioned. And instead of showing pieces going off into deep space, the space got very narrow and flattened, and Will became one of the great masters of doing that. And not just the idea of it being influenced by Japanese painting. In the end, he cooks it down to being his own meal. No one else does it like he does. And instead of tying into a larger movement that's part of the times, it's a very individual movement that he stubbornly stands by, with an integrity that almost no other American painter ever has. He moves by himself instead of with a group. Well, it's a watercolor, and I painted him twice. And the first time we talked about it, and I don't know if he wanted me to do it or whose idea it was first, but we both liked the idea. And we sat out on a hill in Maine, and wasn't done in New York. He had wonderful light in his New York studio, but the afternoon light near his cottage in Maine was just soft and very, very beautiful. And it was that the sun was at the right angle. And I created the first painting with a fair amount of ease, but he was sad about something that day, and there's a sadness that came over the portrait. It influenced how I saw it, And a couple weeks later, maybe the next, I did another one. And we wanted to get the same light, but it started to drizzle, and as it does in Maine, and it doesn't work well for watercolor. And so we went inside and took the side of the studio. But on the far side of the studio was a huge room. The room replicated Will's teaching studio at the Art Students League, which was a very large room. He was one of the most popular teachers of the 20th century. And on the far side, someone looked and they saw a ping pong paddle, and they bounced this ping pong ball around a few times, and the ball came over. It missed the table and hit Will in the head, bounced off. I was very upset. And Will said, I said, I'm going to say something. And he said, do you have a good start, Tim? And I said, I do. And he said, then you know how to concentrate. You know how to be professional. You will stay with this. And I stayed with it, and I left any annoyance away, and people went, and I finished a really nice painting. And the next thing I know, the Smithsonian knew I had it, and they wanted it for their collection. So we were lucky, you know. But it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun that he knew that it would have distracted me enough if I hadn't gotten back to it, and he wanted me to stay focused on the painting, and he knew how to do that. And even with a major distraction, good things can happen, and he knew that with his own work and reminded me to do that. Will had been in Arkansas before you had RAM. He was at the Arkansas Center for the Arts, and they have a number of his drawings. He was there for part of the opening. He came out for that. And so he liked Arkansas. And a number of friends here from Fort Smith were at the National Arts Club for dinner one night, and I came over, and he met about 20 of them. And some of these ladies talk about Will kissed their hand, and the joke here is that they never washed it again, but that's been 5 years. I don't believe it. But Will liked the community, and Will's wife Elena, who there's a portrait of her in there too, a portrait drawing. She liked the community. She felt that when Will passed, a number of friends from this Fort Smith Van Buren area went back to see museums again, and they dropped in to visit with Elena, and they said, come out. And they were all willing to just kind of nurture her. And I remember her saying that there's the Southern hospitality, and it's caring and it's kind. And so from an art standpoint, the fact that everyone loved art from the community that came to visit her, and they also just had a human kindness. He had a warm spot for this very area, and I think he would be very pleased and proud to be here. And I also think that this exhibition that's on in RAM is world class. It's the very best in this community. It deserves it, and I think Will would agree with that 100%. This exhibition gives an overview, and there's little hints of what he does, but it gives us some idea of his working process. But there's more, and after people see this exhibition, they can get a hold of some of his books and see how he changed. Every time he had personal things that made him change, he made a change in his art. That's part of the honesty of being a really great artist. And also, as he developed as an artist, things change. And once people see these pieces, they'll have a foundation to see the wide, full 7-course dinner of Will Barnet's life, and they can look forward to exploring that.